Thank you everyone for coming on a lovely day. You're in the right place if you're here for Enacting Inertia, the Australian climate policy debacle and its global relevance. But does anyone know what this photo is about? A couple of people. All of you will know by the end of the session, because this tells you everything you need to know. First thing, I want to find out what you guys know about Australia and the Australian energy transition. So turn to the person next to you, find out what they know about these questions, if you've been, etc. And then I'm going to pick on random and you're going to tell the rest of the room what someone else knows, if that makes sense. Okay, so stick up your hand if you were born in August. Okay, so you're both at the back not having talked to anyone. Stick up your hand if you're born in September. Okay. I heard this gentleman say something about Australia that was really on point. Can you tell what it is yet? What did he have to say about what he knows about Australia?
He said it was very hot and that there's lots of deserts.
Very hot, lots of desert. Absolutely perfect answers for reasons we'll come back to. Someone born in March? Anyone born in March? No? Okay. January? We're all born. Yep. Okay. So what did this lady know about Australia?
What she knows about Australia?
Yeah.
We were actually talking about energy transition, and we were saying that they probably have access to possible renewable energy technologies there, but we don't know how they're transitioning and what they're transitioning to.
You will by another 30 minutes. So we have 3 crucial pieces of information that have come out. It's hot. So you'd think lots of solar energy potential. It's big. So you'd think there'd be lots of wind energy potential. But it also has lots of mineral resources, specifically coal. And it is the collision of these facts that dominated my life for 4 years. Okay, so super quickly about me. I'm an Australian. I left in '91 and the place has gone seriously downhill since then. I did my PhD at the business school / the Tesco-funded Sustainable Consumption Institute. I passed my Viva. I got minor corrections. I haven't done them yet. You can ask me. Well, I've started them. You can ask me why. I'd want to give some thanks out to my supervisors, my internal examiner, my wife, a couple of friends. Hi, Sam. And a bunch of University of Manchester academics, including several in this room. You know who you are. And librarians are very cool people. So hopefully you're going to leave in less than an hour knowing a bit more about socio-technical transitions and the politics, a bit about public policy theories. You're going to hear an empirical story as well, because we all love our empirics. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions, quite a long one I hope, and I have got some anonymous feedback. Right. Socio-technical transitions. Again, hands up, who has heard of these before? Okay, for the benefit of those of you who haven't. A socio-technical system is a system that is a marriage of a set of social norms and economics and a technological device. So let's take sailing ships. If you were born in the year 1400, you knew about sailing ships. Some people cut down some trees, they make them into planks, other people make sails. There are sailors who learn how to navigate and put up the right sails at the right time. You go forward 400 years and the ships are bigger, but you understand the system and the economics is basically the same. Make sense? You go forward another 100 years and everything has changed. Does anyone know what that one is? Recognize? That's the Titanic. What do you get if you cross the Atlantic with the Titanic? Halfway. In the middle. In the middle, this is, you can't really see it, but this is a picture by Turner, and it's of a steam tug pulling a sailing ship. So you have an overlap period, and that's the transition. You go from one stable state to another stable state. When I say stable, that's not that nothing's happening, that there aren't innovations, incremental battles, but that's what we're talking about. So sailing ships are a good example. You've also got horse and cart to automobility. You've got electrification in grids. All of these are from low carbon to high carbon. Sustainability socio-technical transitions say that we need to go from high carbon to low carbon damned quick. But what about the politics? Because the people who are benefiting from the current system want to keep it that way. That's not a controversial statement, I hope. So there's been a long awareness that there'd be incumbent resistance and that the politics would matter. For a long time, we tried to ignore this, asking about the Dutch experience of transitions management. You have some thinkers who've pointed this out. So James Meadowcroft, Frank Hales, who's at this university, Smink et al. And then more recently, a couple of people, Florian Kern and Katarina Roger, said that, look, if we're going to talk about politics, we need to talk about public policy theories. And this is where my PhD fits. So let's talk very quickly about one public policy theory. There are others, but this is the one that kind of dominated my research. John Kingdon came up with the multiple streams approach in the mid-80s to talk about health policy in the United States. And what he said is you have a problem stream, a politics stream, and a policy stream. So in the problem stream, you have the problems and the people who are trying to bring them onto the agenda, the little NGOs releasing reports, the campaigning groups, etc. The politics stream is where the elections are happening and the politicians are jostling for power and trying to find issues that differentiate them from other political parties. And in the policy stream, you have the grind of policymakers, of think tanks, of white papers, green papers, legislation, reviewed legislation, etc. These three streams can go along without touching for a long time. What you need is what's called a policy entrepreneur to bring the three streams together, and then you get what's called a policy window where basically that problem, that issue, is in the news all the time. And everyone's talking about it and everyone's going, oh, something must be done. Policy windows tend to only last anywhere between 9 months, 2 years, 3 years if you're pushing it. And they tend to be resolved with either a piece of legislation or everyone just gives up and goes, this is in the too hard basket again. Any questions about policy windows? It's a very simple metaphor, and it's too simple a metaphor for you to actually draw any useful conclusions, because where are the incumbents? Where's the political power? It's not here. So I took on another theory, institutional work. Institutions are not the same things as organizations. In popular discourse, they're identical. In political science, in sociology, we speak of institutions as a sort of set of cultural, social, political norms, agreed ways of behaving. So Lawrence and Sotheby, 2006, said that basically there were three forms of institutional work. There are people who work to create institutional norms. So for the longest time, drink driving was considered, yeah, it's not great, but it's okay. And then some people had to work hard. Mothers Against Drunk Driving in the United States is a classic example. I should say, when we get progressive policy change, there'll be a white man who takes the credit for it, but if you actually dig, it's usually a bunch of poor people or black people, and especially women, who are pushing the changes. Being a little normative here, but that's how I see it. So they create a new norm, but then that norm has to be maintained. And disruptive institutional work is to disrupt the existing norms. Some other people came up with the idea that you could have defensive work, the purpose of action of individuals and organizations aimed at countering disruptive institutional work. So these guys, Maguire and Hardy, looked at DDT. So in 1958, DDT was an unproblematic wonder chemical that was going to help us feed the world. By 1970, DDT was popping up in Joni Mitchell's song Big Yellow Taxi. It was being banned everywhere. Marvin Gaye was singing about it too, I think. And in that 10-year period, there was an enormous battle about, well, what is DDT for? What does it do? Still making sense? Moving swiftly on. My research questions and my methodology. Who's done a PhD? Again, a disproportionately large number of people. Research questions are not found down the back of sofas. They're a struggle. So my questions are here. I'm not going to read them out. Let's see if I can get the methodology going. So just while I do this, My methodology, I came up with some timelines, I did lots of interviews, I read lots of newspapers and memoirs. Okay, so 4 windows in Australia. I looked specifically at carbon pricing, which is either a carbon tax or an emissions trading scheme. Not because carbon pricing is the answer to our problems, I would argue it's a very small part of the answer to our problems, but because it made the incumbents, the big coal companies, the big electricity companies, it made them really angry. They behaved as if this was a radical policy innovation. So what I found, and I'm going to take you through these, is that there were 4 periods where the issue was publicly hot. Sorry, 3rd time lucky, I'll just point at the screen. So there were other times that carbon pricing was being discussed, but it was mostly just in the policy window. It was mostly bureaucrats talking to each other and the Australian Emissions Trading Forum, task force, whatever, lobbying to try and get the rules in their favour and no one else paying any attention. So I looked at 4 windows where you could see climate change and carbon pricing on the front page of the newspapers and as the lead or second item in the news. And I'll also very quickly talk about the chaos since 2011, because it has been mad. If I weren't being filmed, I'd use some other words. Right. I look around the room and I think there are other people here who remember this. The coming of climate change as a public issue, James Hansen, Margaret Thatcher speaking about it, George Bush speaking about it, and there was a general retrofitting of climate change within the broader sustainability agenda that Gro Harlem Brundtland and the Brundtland Report was bringing up. In Australia, the window opens in 1989 when the science minister at the time says, look, we're probably going to need to have a carbon tax. By the time he said that, behind the scenes, other people had been coming to the same conclusion, and there's a battle of reports back and forth about what that would mean. This culminates in Australia between September 91 and March 92. There is a flurry of economic modelling reports that have been funded by coal companies and right-wing think tanks that are then linked to journalists in the business press and the Murdoch press, which keeps coming back, so that whenever it looks like the idea of a price on carbon is gaining traction, momentum gets stopped by a we're all going to starve to death, the economy will crash mentality. And they win that battle by March 1992, and it gets so bad that the Australian Prime Minister is the only OECD leader who doesn't go to the Rio Earth Summit. He sends his junior minister. So the incumbents have figured out in this very first window how they can win. And they keep using the same playbook, because why change a winning game? So second window, they've now organised themselves into something called the Australian Industry Greenhouse Network. Pretty much the same story. What happens differently in this one is there's a bit more of a publicity campaign, press releases, trying to mobilise communities that would be affected by a carbon tax, especially in the coal mining areas where there are the resources. They have a trade union on board, the CFMEU, I won't go into the details. And this battle culminates in these 2 round tables with ministers. On one day, all the people in favour of a carbon tax are telling the ministers why it should happen. On the next day, all the people against a carbon tax are telling the minister. And the coal lobby is there in the anti-camp. And that's really important because it's a Labour government in charge at the time. And the Labour government culturally has to listen, and electorally has to listen to the coal union. So the coal union was a very useful ally to the coal companies and the right-wing think tanks and the right-wing politicians in stopping the carbon tax. You also had, Australia has a federal system, we have a federal government, we have state governments, and also you just see that the incumbents have clearly been doing some lobbying behind the scenes to get the state governments on board as well. But the policy entrepreneur pulls his carbon tax before that really kicks in. So you don't see that happen in that window. So this kicked off in 94, 95. You have a period from 96 to 2006 where Australia aggressively pursues loopholes. It signs the Kyoto Protocol but then does not ratify the Kyoto Protocol. It sets up international spoiler organizations. It talks about carbon capture and storage. And then that period ends in 2006 because of things like the European Union Emissions Trading Scheme, the Stern Report, Kyoto getting ratified, Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth, and the drought in Australia really kicking in. And all of this creates a perfect storm. So both the major parties start paying attention to climate change because there's an election coming, it has electoral salience. Both parties say that they're going to have an emissions trading scheme, and then business realizes that it can no longer resist, and therefore the game shifts to getting the best possible deal within an emissions trading scheme by making sure that you get lots of free permits, by making sure that the rules are very lax and that you can sell them and buy them and do all sorts of creative accounting with them. So this quote kind of sums it up. Garnaut is kind of our equivalent of Lord Stern, Robert Peston. Can anyone think? Kevin, you're a really big fan of economists. Who's a reliable economist in the UK? That's a bit of an oxymoron. Okay, so Garnaut is a very, very establishment figure. And in 2008, he says that the most pervasive vested interest pressure on the policy process since the 1920s, most expensive, elaborate and sophisticated lobbying pressure on the policy process ever. Never in the history of Australian public finance has so much been given without public policy purpose by so many to so few. The incumbents have won again. Window 3 ends because Kevin Rudd isn't able to get his legislation through. Tony Abbott, I won't tell you who these people are. They're old white men who are not quite as smart as they think they are. That's all you need to know for these purposes. And it all collapses in a heap. Then Copenhagen is a failure, and the whole house of cards kind of collapses. But the issue doesn't go away. There's an election in Australia where they have a hung parliament. Now, we live in the cradle of democracy. We probably don't have any experience of hung parliaments. Let me tell you, it's no fun. So we have an Australian Prime Minister, a woman, which was also part of her problem, who's forced to bring the issue back onto the table because of electoral considerations. She can't form her minority government without the support of the Greens and a couple of independents. So she tries to basically reheat the Kevin Rudd stuff, and what you see the incumbents do is through the Murdoch press and through radio adverts, TV adverts, websites where you click here and you can contact your MP to say that you don't want the Australian economy to be completely destroyed by an emissions trading scheme, they manage to win. So Kate Blanchett fronts a pro-emissions trading scheme television advert, and she gets shot down as the Hollywood elite who's worth 56 million, and it becomes this incredibly nasty, frankly misogynist as well, cultural battle. And that is summed up by this guy. Does anyone know who this is? It's Tony Abbott. He was the opposition leader at the time. This is him in March of 2011 standing at an anti-carbon tax rally in Canberra in front of a sign that calls Julia Gillard Julia and Bob Brown's bitch. And then back here we have, you can't see it all, but ditch the witch. So they are personalising this.
They forgot to put an apostrophe.
Yes, I know. It turns out that some people can't spell. He apologised for this the day after, but it kind of followed him. Bob Brown is an environmentalist. He's kind of George Monbiot meets Jonathan Porritt plus some integrity. Ooh, couldn't say that. Okay. So window 4 is the first window where something actually gets done. An emissions trading scheme comes into play. The big businesses who are affected by this have kind of just included it in their accounts. They're not that bothered. They'd like it to go away, but it doesn't matter to them either way. So from the 1st of July 2012, we've finally got a price on carbon. That only took 20 years. Great. And emissions from the electricity sector start to go down. Whether you can say that that's caused or correlated is slightly more complex. People who don't like the scheme say it's only a correlation. People who do like the scheme say it's caused, of course. The chaos since. So, Abbott got in as Prime Minister and he tried to tear up everything that Gillard had done around the environment. He was only able to kill off the carbon pricing, which left Australia as the only nation in the world that had repealed national level carbon pricing. It left investors going, what the hell do we do? Our existing power stations need replacing. Do we replace with coal? Do we replace with gas? Do we invest in renewables? What is the signal going to be from government? In the absence of a signal, they hedge. And so they don't build new capacity. And over time, that means the price of everything goes up, which is the story of the last 5 years. There are persistent attempts to try and cobble together some sort of compromise. This story may sound familiar. Someone makes a really stupid decision, and then in the aftermath of that, people try and cobble together compromises. And each time they think they've got one, it falls apart. So they build another one, and it falls apart. No, it doesn't resonate with anything, does it? Okay. What's interesting is that business really starts to lose its rag. They realize that the repeal of the carbon tax has left them in deep trouble. So the Business Council of Australia, which is like the Confederation of British Industry, and other groups are saying, for God's sake, we need something. So Malcolm Turnbull, who's by this time Prime Minister, and we'll see him in a sec, puts together what's called the National Energy Guarantee. Even that is too much. And he gets knifed by his own party in August last year. I was actually there for that. I'd missed all of the other spills. It's great. You just grab popcorn and you just watch the political elite tear itself to pieces. Again, not something that the British are familiar with. Right. So, I did promise we'd get back to this photo, and we're doing all right for time. So this is Malcolm Turnbull. His career was brought down by climate change. I could go into this. Does anyone know who this guy is? One of you? Scott Morrison. When this photo was taken in February of 2017, he was the treasurer. Let me explain what is happening in this photo. It's the middle of a heat wave. People are dying. Electricity grids are crumbling because everyone's coming home, switching on their air conditioning. This guy stands up. Can you see what this is? It's a lump of coal. And he stands up in Parliament, and he's not supposed to do this. And sorry, there's a reason I'm rummaging around in here, because I have brought my own lump of coal. He stands up in Parliament, and I won't show you the clip, but he basically says, this is coal, it's wonderful, and those mongrels on the other side of the house, Labour, have coal phobia. This guy, the idiot with that face, that's Barnaby Joyce, who is the leader of the National Party, which is kind of like take the slightly less socially progressive elements of UKIP and the slightly less socially progressive elements of the DUP, times by 5, and you're getting close to the Nationals. They're supposed to be the party of farmers. They are, sadly, the party of the miners. And this guy over here, Christopher Pyne, is from my state. Pyne's an interesting figure. He's the kind of liberal who, if you were living in liberal means conservative in Australia, go figure. He is the kind of guy who would be supporting a carbon price because it's a market-friendly mechanism. That's how you would expect free market people to want to solve climate change. But he is sitting here delighted that climate change is being turned into a circus. Right, that's really quite depressing. So what do we learn? We learn that what you already knew is that politics is very messy, and people, therefore, like the idea of carbon capture and storage or electric vehicles or some other wonder technology that is going to solve our problems. We learn that incumbents resist and that their resistance shifts. Hands up who's seen the movie Terminator 2. You've missed out, guys. Okay, so if you remember, Arnold is the big robot. You know, you can kind of tell where he is. He's predictably enormous. Fine. In the second movie, there's the shape-shifting metal thing. What I would argue is we need to think of incumbents not as the T-800, the big Arnold, but as the T-1000. They're constantly able to change their shape, change their attitude, bring in unions, drop unions, bring in publics, drop publics, all the while just trying to win. Does that make sense? Okay, fine. We learned that climate change in Australia, and there are reasons for this to do with settler colonialism and misogyny, became a very cultural battle. We also learned that there was an exchange of personnel, which I haven't gone into, especially in the first two windows, between the United States and Australia. You can track the think tanks supporting each other. You can track the American think tanks bringing the Australians on board as part of the anti-Kyoto movement in the mid-90s. They visit each other's countries, they give public speeches, there's money flowing back and forth. That also happens in Windows 3 and 4, but it's particularly noticeable in 1 and 2. And what else we learn is, frankly, that we blew it. Okay, guys, well, hopefully there are some questions. I finally managed to, if you remember my methodology, where I talked about research questions and interviews and memoirs and newspaper articles, this would be my summation of my research process, where you basically just are falling down the stairs until you've broken so many bones that someone takes pity on you and says, yeah, we'll arrange your viva. Okay. So, not to be cynical. Right. Can I see a show of hands? People have got questions. Okay. Ooh, great. I'll try and go quickly. We'll have that lady there, and then this gentleman here. Go ahead.
I have a question on the process rather than on the content of
Yep.
the talk. So, how did you find it being an activist and doing a PhD where you're supposed to be, pros and cons, quite neutral?
Oh, it was easy. Yeah, no, totally. So yes, of course I will. So how did I find it being both an activist and an academic? And I glibly said, oh, it was easy, when clearly it wasn't. Yeah, it's a good question, and I could not have studied Manchester's climate policy debacle because I'm too close to it. And I wouldn't have gotten access because no one would talk to me. So it was easier to do it because it's another country, albeit the one that I grew up with, and it's a 30-year time period. You can get some more distance. I'm not sure that I'm answering your question, and I think what you're trying to get at is that debate between normativity and accuracy. Is that what you...
Well, I wonder if you have policy recommendations for your PhD, they will be taken seriously, because you have an agenda in a way.
Everyone has an agenda. This idea that there are neutral academics, I just think is a joke. And it's the same with neutral journalists. The question is not whether you have an agenda, it's whether you're open about your agenda and you take all reasonable steps to make sure that you are not seeing the things that you want to see and that you're not misrepresenting your opponents and cherry-picking quotes that put them in a bad light. And that's a question of intellectual honesty and to some extent courage. I don't want to say that I'm particularly honest or particularly courageous. I'm just saying that this idea that you're never invested, and that's an interesting word, in your research, no, I just don't buy that. Okay.
Yeah, thanks for the lecture. I find it interesting because of the distance. It was quite easy to see the pattern. And I just wondered if you feel that that is being replicated all over the world, and what is it that's going to lift us out of it?
Those are two questions. No, I'll try and answer both. So, seeing the pattern is to some extent an artifact of the lens that you use. So if you go looking for policy windows, you'll find policy windows. There are other public policies theories I could have used, and I might have gotten slightly different results. So it comes back to this sort of epistemology, ontology question. One of the things I would like to do is to see if I could replicate the policy window, the rise and fall of an issue in the European Union. Some people have done a little bit of work on that. America would be slightly more complex because there are even more moving parts, but I think it could be done, and I think it would probably tell you something useful. In terms of how we get out of this mess, my answer would be that the Extinction Rebellion people, the youth climate strike people, the activists in Manchester have to understand that this is now a very, very mature policy debate that's been going on for 30 years. They have to understand that there are very well-established techniques that incumbents, whether they're economic or political, use to contain dissent, to co-opt those who can be co-opted, to ignore those who can be ignored, and to repress the rest.
Thank you, that's helpful.
Okay, cool. Sir.
I'm ashamed to say I didn't know much about people's assemblies until recently, which struck me as an excellent idea. Now, you tried this on climate change in Australia and they were knocked down. Could you say a bit about that?
Sure. So, when Julia Gillard became Prime Minister under difficult circumstances, she knew that climate change was still going to be an election issue. And the compromise that she came up with was something that a Blair advisor suggested was a people's assembly of 150 people who were going to debate the issue, hear from experts for a year, and then come up with a series of recommendations. And within a couple of days, this had been laughed into non-existence in the middle of the election campaign in 2010. And people said, yeah, we already have 150 people who are paid to listen to experts. It's called Parliament, which 150, we have 150 MPs. We don't have the joy of 660 like the UK. There's an Australian political philosopher called John Dryzek, D-R-Y-Z-E-K, and he's done lots of work on deliberative democracy, especially around environment issues. There's also a wonderful paper by Robin Eckersley in the latest issue of Environmental Politics, looking at old-style environmental deliberative democracy versus new ecological deliberative democracy. And Australia was really the place where this was tried. So I didn't talk about it, but in the 1989 to 1992 window, we had this thing called the Ecologically Sustainable Development Process, which was an attempt at deliberative democracy. And the recommendations were actually relatively radical, and they were agreed by business grudgingly. And then those disappeared when there was a change of leader from Bob Hawke to Paul Keating. Keating was an old school traditional economics will solve everything, get the market price right, and everything's okay. So the incumbents they got lucky that Keating came in. If Hawke had had another 6 months or a year, the battle would have been different. Have I answered your question? Sort of? Maybe? A bit?
Yeah, just in Ireland, when they used it over abortion, it was very successful.
Yeah.
In that situation, it strikes me as an excellent way. Do you agree?
I agree that we need far more deliberation generally within society at a local level, regional level, and national level. My hesitation is that a one-off deliberative assembly to tackle such a question has a high risk of failure and is manipulable. I would like to see lots more deliberative assemblies on a whole host of issues. And I think abortion and climate change, they're not quite the same thing. I think, yeah? Okay, more questions. Hands up. 1, 2, 3.
At a national level, Australian political democracy has been hollowed out by neoliberal elite and its culture. So is there a need then for a real drastic political transition in tandem with the energy transition to end up where Oz needs to be in 10 years? I mean, you've answered some.
So does there need to be a fundamental systemic transition? Well, that would be a normative commitment on my part, and I'm a value-free researcher. Yes. And basically, Naomi Klein kind of makes the point that we had some bad luck in that at exactly the same time we were figuring out that the climate change issue was a real problem that we should do something about. The scientists had been worried about it since the early 70s and got ferociously worried about it by the mid-80s. At exactly the same time, the neoliberal thing took off, and neoliberalism and environmental sustainability they don't mesh. We know this because we've had 30 years of emissions trading schemes and ecological modernization, and things are getting worse. It turns out that emissions are, what is it, Kevin? 60% higher than they were in 1990? 67, there you go. Going once, going twice, gone. So yes, we're not going to solve the problems with the same tools that cause the problems. But that creates, have you read Animal Farm? I recommend everyone in this room reads Animal Farm. No, seriously, that's what's going on. A bunch of pigs have figured out the rhetoric of democracy, and there are still the hollowed rituals of it, but life is no better than it was under Manor Farm. I couldn't possibly comment on Rupert Murdoch. Next question.
Thanks, Mark. I wanted to ask you about the bunch of pigs. You talk about incumbents,
Yeah.
but you also frame the talk in terms of socio-technical systems
Yeah.
and institutional theory. So I wasn't clear who your incumbents were.
Were you earwigging on my Viva? Because this is the exact same question. And the way that I got out of that hole, and I had anticipated this as a question, and I think it's an important problem, is to think of a processual incumbency with membership of that incumbency coalition coming in, going out, there being a core of people who have economic or political or cultural interests that don't really change, and other people who are tactically obliged or motivated to participate, possibly against their own long-term interests, in that incumbency. It's a dodge. I'm not happy with it as an answer, but it's the best answer I've got at the minute.
I just think it's important, because if that's where the power is happening, then we need to maybe part of the power is that we don't know who these people are or where these things actually are happening. And maybe if we can have more clarity on that, it helps.
You shall know the truth and the truth shall set you free. I don't think the truth does set you free. I think as well as knowing what these guys are up to, and it's usually guys, we also have to have our own ways of combating that and of putting forward better alternatives and keeping those better alternatives on the policy agenda and forcing the policy process to deliver on what it's promising. So it's easy for politicians to make promises. It's easy for them to therefore get a certain percentage of the population to go back to sleep. Matters are in hand. It's the year in, year out grind of making sure that those promises are being kept that has been the failure of the social movements in Australia. Kevin? Sorry, you there, because I'm not supposed to know who anyone is.
Well, I think it's an interesting discussion to be had on the neoliberal model and this idea about whether they're actually interested in economic structures like EUTS and pricing. I don't think they are at all interested in power.
Yes.
And in fact, they use those to maintain their power.
Yes.
They don't like them. That's why they make sure they're always very small.
Yeah.
My other question was, you made right at the beginning the comment that with these social-technical transitions, we've gone from high carbon to low carbon.
Yeah.
What should we have?
I saw you wince. No, I'm sorry. Can I just say, that's what we're supposed to do. That's what the aspiration, the ambition would be. That's what sustainability, socio-technical transitions.
So you said we have historically gone from high carbon to low carbon.
No, sorry, I misspoke. From low carbon to high carbon.
Sorry, low carbon.
Yeah.
That bit I was questioning because I thought,
Okay.
well, actually, have we? In
Go on.
planes we haven't, electricity we haven't, PCs we haven't, cars we haven't. But the problem is growth. So in almost all of those, what we've done for the social-technical transitions is actually we've made them more efficient. So you go further on your plane than you used to, you go further in your car, your PC's much lower energy consumption, and all of those things have improved. The problem is we've grown. So it's not that we've actually gone the wrong way, it's just that we've actually expected to do more of them. And that's to me, so it's the growth bit that comes out is the real problem there, not necessarily the direction.
Yes. When I was growing up, the world's population was 4 billion. It's now 7.5 billion. And at the same time, and before you jump in because I'm about to say the next thing to agree with you. Levels of consumerism and consumption have gone through the roof. You look at, an interesting thing to do is to look at ads aimed at children from the 1970s. You can find them on YouTube, and they're laughably unsophisticated. And go and have a look at how kids get advertised at now. It's astonishing. And this has happened in the last 20, 30 years. Coincidentally, alongside neoliberalism, maybe there's a link. So what do we do about it, though? I mean, because none of us wants to get off the planet, particularly. None of us wants to reduce our consumption. I think the problem is growth. I think the problem is also hubris. I think the problem is also vast overconfidence in our technical systems, in our social systems. I don't want to get into whole sort of Darwinistic or Freudian perceptions of, humans as fundamentally flawed. Not here. Buy me some pints and I will. Does that make sense? I've not answered your question? Yeah, I think neoliberalism is a problem. Growth is a problem. The lack of democracy is a problem. I could go on all day about all the problems. And you're not going to disagree. You've already had one go. Other questions? Sorry, hands up, because we've got another 10 minutes. 1, 2, 3. Yeah. 4. Or we'll come back. Yeah. 1 and 2 for sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, with kind of the Green New Deal
Mm.
in the news, I see the kind of the incumbents over there were using the kind of the jobs and economy card to try and win the arguments there. Was anything like that ever proposed? Say Australia could be the Saudi Arabia of renewables. Or
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So the Green New Deal, for people who don't know, there's a big movement in the there's a movement in the United States at the minute to get the Democrats to take on board this idea that you can have a state-sponsored, state-orchestrated transformation of the economy, a Green New Deal like Roosevelt and the Depression. The rhetoric actually comes from the UK. At the time of the global financial crisis in 2008, there were reports by well-meaning sort of soft green, soft left think tanks, the sort of New Economics Foundations and Pettifords of this world. To answer your question, absolutely. The Australian Conservation Foundation, which is our equivalent of Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace and other groups tried to use this rhetoric of look at all the jobs in renewables. Australia has enormous renewable energy potential. Again, lots of sun, lots of wind. And we could have done it. And this to me is the tragedy. And my PhD, I would have loved to have looked not just at carbon pricing, but the way that renewables were persistently and consistently attacked. Because if you're an incumbent, you don't want people being able to put solar panels on their roof and never have to pay an electricity bill again, do you? You want your hook into them year in, year out. Now, I'm not saying that solar panels on every individual roof is the answer, because you need a grid. And someone has to pay for the maintenance of that grid. But yes, there was from 1990, you can find reports by scientists, reports by government departments at times, by NGOs, all saying if we invest in renewables, if we invest in energy efficiency as well, because Australian houses are terrible. If we invest in those things, we can reduce aggregate demand without hurting the economy. We can create export markets and everything will be great. And those reports were basically ignored. Very occasionally they were useful to a politician, so he or she would put on a hard hat and stand somewhere. But on the whole, until the last 5 years, ignored.
Is there an identifiable or even a statutory view of the Aboriginal population of Australia on the issues you're talking about?
I'll say 3 things. One is that if anyone tells you there wasn't genocide in the settlement of Australia, they're full of crap. Number 2, I'm relatively ignorant of the specific Aboriginal positions. What you do see is large opposition to extractive industries. So the Adani coal mine is being challenged by the traditional owners of the land through the legal system. You have a lot of the young activists in Australia are from either Australian Indigenous or Pacific Island countries who are full on, like sort of Greta Thunberg and everyone else, saying this is totally unacceptable. But Australian Aborigines also have so much else on their plates at the same time, around violence, around police brutality, around dispossession from land, etc., etc. So climate change, they're not denying it, but it tends not to be at the top of their list, if we say there as a broader community. But there are lots of young Aboriginal activists working really hard on this, and they should be honoured and supported. Does that answer your question? How are we doing for time? We've got 5 minutes, 4 minutes?
Yeah, so thanks for we do have 4 minutes before it's 2. I understand some of you may want to head on to the next thing on your day. So please, if people wish to have a few more questions, we can stay here for
I'll try and be quicker in my answer.
10 minutes or so. We can still use the room for about 10 more minutes. So yeah, please feel free if you need to move on. I know Chris needs to move on.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, but before you guys leave, just thank you all for listening today, and